Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the third in a series of programs I'm doing on loneliness and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, religion, and literature have said about it. I've pointed out that studies in psychology indicate that virtually all people experience loneliness, either in the past or currently. In my previous programs on loneliness, I've elaborated on what are some of the chief causes of loneliness. For example, I've pointed out that a lack of caring and sharing can cause people to experience loneliness. For example, when our expectations of caring and sharing are not met, that can cause us to feel lonely. I've also pointed out that a lack of meaningful conversation, a lack of meaningful communication can also engender lonely feelings. Isn't it true that conversations with others can involve mask wearing? And isn't it true in conversations with others, sometimes we don't say what we really feel and think, but rather what we think other people want to hear. The great English novelist Charles Dickens raised the question, does anyone ever get to know anyone else very well? And in The Tale of Two Cities, perhaps his greatest book, he penned the following words: every human being is constituted to be that profound secret and mystery to every other human being. And Thoreau lamented the rareness of sincerity. It was a common lament of Thoreau's. And here is his take. He said this, and I'm quoting Thoreau: I sat at a table where were rich food and wine in abundance, but sincerity was not, and I went away hungry. Of course, another major cause of loneliness can be sorrow, serious illness, divorce, loss of a loved one. All these experiences are sad experiences, and isn't it true? Our sadness is often accompanied by a feeling of loneliness. After all, no one can suffer for us. I also mentioned last week that ignorance of others' suffering and self-absorption can cause us loneliness. The idea that I'm the only one who feels frustrated and angry and unhappy. The idea that life's easy for everybody else but difficult for me. That's a lonely feeling. Is it possible that many people are fooled by all the smiling faces around them? For example, the smiling faces on television and advertising. I think it's fair to say you will see more smiling faces in 4 minutes of television commercials than you will if you ride the New York City subways at rush hour for a week. All the great religions and great philosophers teach that suffering will never be completely absent from our lives. A famous Buddhist monk put it this way: deep inside, every one of us is carrying a very heavy load. As human beings, it is natural that we feel frustration and anger and even hatred. We are trying to suppress them. Well, what's the wisest attitude we could adopt towards others? Well, there's practically a unanimity of opinion among the great thinkers that the wisest attitude would include having compassion for other people. Indeed, I pointed out that the German philosopher Schopenhauer believed that as we grow older, one of two dispositions will come to dominate our personality, either envy or compassion. Envy, Schopenhauer claimed, increases our loneliness. Compassion decreases our loneliness. Finally, last week, I pointed out that another major cause of loneliness is answering the question, how shall I live? Or I should say, deciding on how I should live. The idea is that decision-making is often a lonely experience. What kind of job shall I work? What should my values be? How much shall I value money and material possessions, status? How much should I value popularity, sex, religion? How moral should I be? Where should I look for a guide to the good life? Should I look to television, advertising, pop music, movies, religion, books, my inner voice? Kierkegaard, perhaps the greatest of Danish philosophers, said that decision-making is the most important of human activities. It is through the choices we make that we create ourselves and our lives. And as I indicated earlier, decision-making can be a very lonely activity. What I'd like to do in this program is to focus in on another major cause of loneliness, and that is being different, not being understood, even being excluded. And the examples I wish to use to illustrate this idea concern the Jewish experience, the black experience, and the gay experience. First, the Jewish experience. Jewish people, for approximately 2,000 years, were tormented by many people who persecuted them. We know that in Europe it was not unusual that Jews would be regarded as Christ killers. Jews were different. They weren't Christians, but they lived, at least most Jews lived in Europe, an area of the world populated predominantly by Christians. Jews were often segregated, even expelled. In the 13th century, England expelled its Jews. Indeed, Stephen Greenblatt, an expert on William Shakespeare, claims that it's possible that Shakespeare never met a Jew in England. And Shakespeare, by the way, lived several centuries after the Jews were expelled from England. Spain also expelled its Jewish population. The Spanish did this in the 15th century. And many countries that did not expel its Jewish people isolated them in what were called Jewish ghettos. And of course, Jews experienced much discrimination and an habitual fear of pogroms. Sigmund Freud, a Jew, in his autobiography, talks about his freshman year at the University of Vienna in Austria. And Freud says that because he was a Jew, he was expected to feel and act inferior to the Christians. The idea is that Jews were expected to act inferior, just as blacks, for so much of United States history, were expected to feel and act inferior to whites in America. And we know that when the Nazis took over Germany in the 20th century, they instituted what were known as the Nuremberg Laws. These laws were very discriminatory. They deprived Jews of German citizenship. They banned Jews from working certain professions, or I should say from working in certain professions. For example, Jews could not be teachers. Jews could not work in the publishing business. Jews could not even give concerts. Famous Jewish musicians, composers, were banned from performing. And of course, we know ultimately the Nazis were responsible for the Holocaust, in which over 6 million Jews perished. Interesting, Germany, a Christian nation. Germany was a Christian nation, and imagine Christians, followers of Jesus, not judging Jews on the basis of the content of their character, but solely on their Jewishness, persecuting Jews over the centuries in defense of a God whose chief law, whose chief commandment was that we should love one another. And to add irony to insult, Christ was a Jew. It's been said that man is a speck of reason in an ocean of emotion. What do you think? I suspect that being Jewish over the centuries not infrequently increased the loneliness all human beings experience at times. And now to the black experience. Blacks in the United States experienced more than 200 years of slavery, and then 100 more years of degradation and second-class citizenship. Is there a worse sin than enslaving people? Specifically, is there a worse sin than enslaving children? By the time of the Civil War, there were more than 4 million slaves in the United States. Many hundreds of thousands of them were children. And as I've pointed out in a previous program, virtually all the southern states had laws prohibiting the education of slave children, prohibiting them from learning how to read and write. The idea was, should the black children learn how to read and write, they might not be as docile, they might be more difficult to control. Slavery also, of course, was an invitation to sexual abuse. Imagine your daughter being enslaved by someone. And of course, we know that there were many mulattoes walking around in the pre-Civil War South. Again, evidence that some white slave owners were having sex with some of their slaves. Well, we know that Abraham Lincoln's election and presidency did bring some dramatic changes to America, but unfortunately it did not completely solve the problem. Yes, the South lost the Civil War, but it decided that even though it had lost the Civil War, it would try to keep black people in their place, so to speak. And of course, their place was an inferior status to white people. And how did Southern whites, how did Southern governments attempt to keep blacks in an inferior position? Well, the Southern governments instituted a system of racial segregation based on law. Segregation based on law. So that blacks were separated from whites in schools, luncheonettes, restaurants, parks, beaches, movie theaters. Indeed, even Major League Baseball discriminated against blacks. No black was able to play in the major leagues for approximately the first 75 years of Major League Baseball. It wasn't until Jackie Robinson played for the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947 that we had a black in the major leagues. And by the way, Jackie Robinson was 28 years old at that time, a college graduate and a commissioned officer, and had been a commissioned officer in the military. Why do I emphasize that he was 28 years old at the time? Well, it's unusual that a baseball rookie is 28. Usually, outstanding baseball players have the opportunity to play in the major leagues at age 21, 22, or thereabouts. But Robinson, being black, had to wait until the age of 28. And of course was fortunate in the sense that he was even allowed to play in the major leagues. The first black, again, to play in the major leagues. we also know that southern states erected all kinds of barriers to try to prevent black people from voting. It is interesting that black men and women fought in World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. Yet these black soldiers came back to Mississippi, to Alabama, to Texas, and were usually prevented from voting, almost always prevented from voting. Also, of course, more than 3,000 blacks were lynched in the South. They were hanged. No trial, no jury, no charges leveled against them. And in almost all cases, after a black man was hanged, usually on some trumped up allegation, such as he looked at a white woman in the wrong way, or maybe was uppity with white people, after the black man was hanged, almost always there were no arrests, nobody went to jail. The idea was, in the South, you could literally get away with murdering a black person. Talk about child abuse. Child abuse on a grand scale. Millions of black children in the South conditioned to feel inferior and expected to act in an inferior way. This was America in 1950 and indeed as late as 1960. Yes, America had democracy for white people, not black people. And also, it is interesting, like Germany, a country which engaged in horrendous persecution of Jews, America also was a Christian country engaging in incredible discrimination against black people. In past programs, I've spoken of happiness givers and happiness stealers. This was happiness stealing on a grand scale. What was going on in the southern part of the United States was people molestation on a grand scale. How would you feel? How would you feel about a social system aimed at making your children feel inferior? Again, how would you feel about a social system aimed at making your children feel inferior? In 1954, the Supreme Court addressed itself to this issue, specifically to the issue of segregation in public schools. As I mentioned, there were laws in the southern states imposing segregated schools on the populations there, so that black children went to one set of public schools and white children to another. Well, in 1954, the National Association of Colored People challenged racial segregation and won. The Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, all 9 white judges decided that racial segregation by law in schools violated the United States Constitution and ordered that public schools be integrated. Let me give you a brief excerpt, just 1 or 2 sentences from the court's decision. Again, these are the Supreme Court's own words in its decision in a case called Brown versus Topeka, Kansas, 1954. Again, the court's words. To separate black children from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. I've been talking about loneliness and causes of it. Specifically, I've zeroed in on the Jewish experience, especially in Europe, and the black experience in the United States. The idea being that being different, being excluded, can be a serious cause of loneliness. Two very fine books written by black men on this subject, books that are quite illuminating in pointing out the loneliness that blacks often experienced, are the following. Nobody Knows My Name by James Baldwin, who grew up in Harlem, and The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. Those titles are very revealing, aren't they? Nobody Knows My Name and The Invisible Man. The message of those books is that I'm a human being. I have feelings. I have needs. I have desires. Don't you see that? Don't my tormentors see my humanity? Another great book on the black experience in America was written by a white man who made himself black. It's a fantastic story. John Howard Griffin, a white writer, in the late 1950s, decided he wanted to know what it was like to be black in the southern part of the United States. So he did some research to determine whether it was possible for him to appear black. And he was told that if he took certain pills and used a sun lamp, that the pills, a certain medication he would take, in conjunction with ultraviolet light, would give his skin a black taint, so to speak. And what he did was he did take the pills, he used the ultraviolet light and shaved his head, so that in 1959 he went through the South posing as a black man, and again wrote a very famous book about it called Black Like Me. And what Griffin did was this. After going through the South for several months as a black man, he stopped taking the pills. He stopped using the ultraviolet light. He let his hair grow back in. And then he went back to the exact same places in the South he had gone to as a black man, now as a white man, to see and to experience what a dramatic difference there was in his experiences. It's a terrific book. It sold millions of copies over the years. It's in paperback. Again, I highly recommend it. It's called Black Like Me by John Howard Griffin. It is also interesting that even the movie industry, at least unintentionally, conspired to keep black people in their place in America. That when blacks were depicted in Hollywood movies, for example, they were not shown to be doctors, lawyers, teachers, professors, electricians, plumbers. No, they were usually depicted doing the most menial jobs. So that when black children in America went to the movies in the 1940s and the 1950s, for example, the role models they saw were not of educated people. Needless to say, we have made enormous progress. In 1964, our federal government passed a Civil Rights Act banning racial segregation in public places. And the following year, the Congress passed an historic law called the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which guaranteed, at least attempted to guarantee, that black people would no longer be prevented from voting in the United States. And of course, we have seen so many positive changes in America, so that nowadays, black people occupy influential positions in almost all areas of our society. That's not to say that we still don't have work to do in improving racial relations in America. I suspect that being black in the United States for much of our history has not infrequently increased the loneliness all human beings experience at times. What do you think? I've been talking about the Jewish experience primarily in Europe and the black experience in the United States as possible significant causes of loneliness for large segments of people. What I wish to do now is to zero in on the homosexual experience throughout the world. I see that I'm running short on time, so I have only a few minutes to talk about this today, and I will continue with this next week. Homosexuals, we know, over the centuries, in many parts of the world, have been social outcasts. Indeed, homosexual sex has been illegal in many areas of the world. One had to live in the closet in many parts of the world, and in the past and even today. I think it's fair to say that having to live in the closet can be a lonely experience. Not to mention that homosexuals have been exposed to some of the most damaging descriptions and terms. So many homosexuals have been called queers and faggots. We now know, by the way, that some of the most intelligent, sensitive, courageous, talented people in history were homosexual or bisexual. We also know that some of the most macho men in history were homosexual or bisexual. Again, I see I'm running short on time, and I'm so disappointed I don't have more time to devote to the loneliness of the homosexual experience, but I promise you next week I will continue with this. Right now, as usual, I would like to close with a quote from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau, in Walden, his masterpiece, penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."